All right, welcome everybody to another episode of the Unapologetic Apologist. I'm super excited to introduce my next guest. We've talked before, and it's a he's been all over the place. His YouTube channel's been growing because he's having all these great debates, and it's just awesome. I'm a huge fan of him, Mr. TJump. Thank you so much for being here, sir.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the invite. It's always nice to talk with you. I really enjoyed our conversation last time, so happy to be here.
Yeah, so did I. I really appreciate you inviting me on. So yeah, guys, if you haven't yet, go subscribe to his YouTube channel. TJump. The link should be in the video here if you can see at the bottom. So I guess just as an introduction, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is TJump, and how did you get to where you are now, kind of doing this kind of thing? Would you consider yourself always kind of more of a skeptic, kind of leaning towards atheism, or was it kind of a journey you developed to getting there?
Yeah, so I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe there are no reasons to believe in the existence of God. And the way I got here was I started having conversations and debates about with professors, local professors around my universities. I invited them to go out get cups of coffee and have conversations with them. And I got lucky enough to have some pretty big guys who went out to coffee with me, like Greg Boyd and Paul Eddies, who wrote the Jesus Legend, big historiographer guys. And I really enjoyed these conversations. I got pretty good at them, and I decided to start putting them online on YouTube. And when I did, I started getting a pretty good, decent following from it. And from there, it just took off. Started making money off of it, so I kept doing it.
Right on. So would you say you kind of always leaned that way, even since a young age, or was there like kind of like a moment when you were like, something about this doesn't make sense to me?
Well, I was actually brought up Christian, but after years and years and years of never having my prayers answered, I just kind of, the faith just kind of fizzled out and I stopped believing sometime in high school.
Okay. So you said kind of your premise is you don't think there are any good reasons to believe in God. And I know you've gotten asked this before, and I'm not trying to. This isn't like a trick question on disagreeing over the definition of atheism. I'm whoever I'm talking to, whatever definition they give me, that's what I'm happy discussing. So this isn't like a trick thing. But would you say you do believe, or maybe you don't believe, that there are, say, positive arguments that lead to the conclusion God doesn't exist?
Well, I definitely think there are reasons to believe God doesn't exist, like the problem, suffering, and the contradictions and the properties of God, but that's usually not the reason I go with the definition of atheism. So it's like due to the fact that you can imagine like infinitely many things, like leprechauns, unicorns, Zeus, Thor, that don't exist. We can imagine these are imaginary things that don't exist in reality. If we have no reason to believe something does exist, that's a reason to believe it doesn't exist. So if you posit something like a God and you haven't given, and there's no reasons to believe that God exists, well, that's a reason to believe that God's just imaginary until demonstrated otherwise. That's the difference between modern atheism and agnosticism, is that modern atheists take the position it's imaginary until demonstrated otherwise. So the fact that you've posited it and there isn't any evidence to go along it is itself a reason to believe it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
That's essentially the default position. That's what most atheists today, modern atheists, the position they hold, which is why it's not the same as agnosticism, because agnosticism is just maybe God exists, maybe God doesn't exist, we don't know. But modern atheism is the position that it's imaginary until demonstrated otherwise.
Mm. So, but I would assume you would differentiate yourself from maybe people who would claim you should only believe things that you can demonstrate, right? Like you can only believe what's scientifically proven or something. You're not making that claim, right?
No, because there's definitely things that don't need to be demonstrated, like any imaginary conceptual things like math and logic and language and all kinds of things that don't need to be empirically demonstrated to be reasonable. But if you claim something exists in reality, you would need some criteria to differentiate that thing from an imaginary thing. And the criteria I use is demonstrability. But any kind of way that we can differentiate between whether or not it's imaginary or real would qualify as evidence.
Okay. Okay. And so what would you say, maybe to kind of broaden out from just there's no reason to believe in God? What would you say is like your overall worldview? Because I know a lot of times in the discussion when we talked before, there was kind of, well, naturalistic pantheism can do whatever, say, a theistic God can do. But I actually don't know. Would you consider yourself a naturalistic pantheist, or is that more just an example you use for the sake of argument?
No, I don't actually believe in naturalistic pantheism. It's just an alternative to show that all the arguments and evidence work equally as well for a non-God as they do for a God. To try and illustrate my example of the rabbit in the box, like we have a 2 pound box, we don't know what's in it. You claim a rabbit's in it because it weighs 2 pounds. Well, that 2 pounds can be explained by infinitely many other things, which means it's not evidence of a rabbit. And so I'm just using that same kind of analogical approach to say the same arguments used for theism can be explained by a rabbit or a lizard, just like they can be for a god or pantheism. So they're not actually evidence of a god. So I don't actually believe in naturalistic pantheism. My worldview would probably be methodological naturalism. Like we only have reason to believe in the natural thing so far because that's what we have evidence for. But I don't really take a stance on ontology, like what is the fundamental nature of reality. We just don't know. We can't answer those kinds of questions, and I'm totally happy to admit that and just say we shouldn't make claims about what the fundamental nature of reality is. We should only make claims about what we have evidence and what we can demonstrate methodologically.
Right. So when we're talking about, say, prior to the Big Bang, and more theistic argumentation would say, well, you need something that looks more like a god here, and then you kind of run the parallel argument and say, well, actually, no, you can have this naturalistic pantheism that has all the same things, remove the consciousness, but your actual position would be you more so remain agnostic about what was prior to the Big Bang.
Right. Science doesn't tell us what's before the Big Bang, so the correct answer is to say we don't know and just stop there.
Right on. So one thing I did want to explore, because I've been trying to think this through, and maybe you can tell me if I have anything here. I had made a claim, and I had misspoke when I was on your show last time, when I said philosophy is kind of our tool at getting at what would be the case in every possible world. The correct thing would be for me to say, well, is there's more of a specific branch of philosophy, which is metaphysics, and that's the claims about what would be the case in any possible world, and you disagreed with that. So where would be where you kind of disagree? Whether are we like not able to make any claims about what would be the case in any possible world?
Well, there's a couple things there. One is that it's not metaphysics, it's modal logic specifically that deals with
Okay.
possible worlds, like modal S5 logic specifically. But the idea that we can get to what every possible world would be like is not reasonable. Like, for example, the ontological argument says there's the greatest possible being in all possible worlds. Well, no. Like that assumes that there is this property of greatest that exists, and it exists not only in our world, but in all possible worlds, and that it's the same in all possible worlds, which is completely ridiculous. Like there's no reason to assume that. Like everything, all of the laws of physics could be different in every possible world. So all of these hypothetical laws like greatness could also be different in every possible world. So there may be a greatest possible thing in all possible worlds, but they wouldn't be the same thing. Or greatness may not exist as a property at all. And so assuming that we can actually tell what every possible world is going to be like is ridiculous. We can only make parallels to what our world is like and say, so here's how we know our world is like, and we can try and make copies of that in our head and imagine different ways it could be, like different laws of physics or whatever. But we can't actually know what every possible world would be like. All we can do is describe every possible world what we can imagine would be like. That's it.
Mm. Okay, so my argument, I would actually agree with a lot of that. I would never say like, I don't know, we can know what the laws of physics would be like in every possible universe, or that specifically humans instead of something else, or if sentient life would exist at all. I would say more fundamental. I do think, and maybe I'm mistaken here, I do think we can make claims that, for example, the laws of logic would have to apply in any possible world. Would you disagree there?
Well, the laws of logic are descriptive, not prescriptive. So they only apply in the fact that when we see the world, this is how we would describe it. That's all it means. It doesn't mean that's how the universe operates. Like, for example, instead of describing something with the law of non-contradiction, you could describe it with the intuitionistic logic and say it's on a scale from true to false. And it's not either true or false. It's somewhere along that scale. So it's both true and false at the same time. Or something like Schrodinger's cat in our universe, where it's not either dead or alive. It's both at the same time. So the laws of logic don't apply to a universe. It's that the laws of logic, we use them to describe things we see. So they don't like govern a universe. They just describe it like a language. Like English would apply to every universe because we would use English to describe the universe, but it doesn't mean that the universe is restricted by the language of English, just like it wouldn't be restricted by the laws of logic.
Okay, I know that sometimes some people say, well, no, the laws of logic are prescriptive, and then your argument is, well, no, they're descriptive. So I would fall somewhere in between there. I don't want to say they're prescriptive of a universe, right? That they're kind of Platonic abstract objects, and then they kind of govern the way a universe is. I would say they are descriptive, but I would say they're descriptive of a more fundamental reality from which the universe springs, and so then any universe that would spring from that would go along with these. And one thing, well, I'll kind of lead into my argument there. So would you say a claim we can make? Well, because you've talked about the metaphysical claim, I think therefore I am. Would you say that we can only know that for this universe? We couldn't necessarily make that claim about all possible worlds?
Well, if you thought you would exist in all possible worlds, I assume. So, yes, you can say that about all possible worlds. If you existed in any possible world and you thought, then you would exist.
Mm-hmm. And the only reason is it's not like a trick question. I'm thinking because, for example, the law of non-contradiction. So let's say I can extrapolate from just I think therefore I am would say be the case in any possible world. Then you would have to have the law of non-contradiction be the case in any possible world. Because if there's a possible world, for example, where the law of non-contradiction doesn't apply, right? Like that's not a thing. That's not something you can use to accurately describe reality. Well, you'd have to be stuck with weird things, weird contradictions, like I think, therefore I don't exist. But if in either world you would be thinking, but the conclusion would be different, it would seem to me as you couldn't actually distinguish between which world you existed in the world where I think leads to I do exist versus the world where I think leads to I don't exist.
Well, again, the laws of logic are purely descriptive. So you're using the laws of logic to describe the way things are. You can use not intuitionistic logic, which is the truth-false scale, where it's not just one, it's not either or, it's on a scale of truth or false. And that could also apply to the statements like I think therefore I am, just as much as it could like anything. So again, the law of non-contradiction are purely, it's just a language, nothing more than English. It's exactly the same thing. It's just a formal language. You can just go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on classical logic. The first line is logic is a formal language. So logic does not apply to universes. It doesn't govern them. It doesn't, not universes don't pop into existence following these laws. It's just when we see a universe, we describe it using these figments of language. Just like when we see a tree, we use English to describe the tree. So the universe is completely independent. It exists independently of logic. Logic is unnecessary in its entirety from the universe. We just use logic to describe the universe. And there's different logics we can use. We don't have to use standard logic with the law of non-contradiction. We could use quantum logic or fuzzy logic or intuitionistic logic. And standard logic has problems with it, which is why all these other logics were created, which show that it's not perfect and it doesn't work in all cases. So logic, this application to try and say that logic is prescriptive to universes and applies to all possible worlds is complete nonsense. It's just a language. It's like saying English applies in all possible worlds. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, so I want to be careful, and I'm trying to not get too much into Christian theology here. I agree. There are people. There's a debate among Christian philosophers about whether, for example, laws of logic are abstract objects or they're not, or there's a debate between realist approaches and non-realist approaches. So a realist approach would fall into the kind of category like if someone was a divine conceptualist, they do believe that kind of when God creates that, okay, there's these laws of logic and or that they exist kind of as thoughts in his head, and so they're prescriptive in that way. That's not my position. So I'm a non-realist. So I do believe that fundamental reality, if you want to call that God, or even if you want to call it naturalistic pantheism, that what fundamental reality is, that laws of logic are descriptive of fundamental realities. They're just descriptive of that. But then what I'm disagreeing with is that there would be a universe that would maybe come into existence kind of as an extension of fundamental reality, but then would kind of deviate and go out of that kind of norm.
Well, again, it's when you say that it could deviate from the norm. It's like saying a tree can deviate from English.
Not deviate from the norm, but I mean, well, yeah.
Well, no, I understood what you're saying there, but the idea is that something can't exist and deviate from English because English is an abstract. There's no relation between the two. English just describes what already exists. So logic doesn't control it.
But English wouldn't, for example, make up what things are. Like things wouldn't change based on how you described them.
Right. The same is true of logic.
Yeah, but so English is okay. So I see what you're saying, but so and I don't actually think I'm disagreeing with it. So you could say, okay, maybe we don't have to use the law of non-contradiction. We can call it the law of something else, but it would be describing the same thing, just as multiple languages would be describing the same thing.
No, that's the part I'm saying is not the case. Like, for example, the law of non-contradiction is binary. It says either it's true or false. Intuitionistic logic is different. It does not say it's either true or false. It's on a spectrum, like a percentage. It's some percent true and some percent false. So it would disagree with the law of non-contradiction, which is a binary and is only either true or false, and say that it exists on a spectrum. So it can be both true and false at the same time to some degree, which is kind of the point of quantum mechanics, where the cat can both be alive and dead at the exact same time. So it's not the case that it's either true or false 100% of the time. That's not the case. In quantum physics, we know that's not the case. Reality does not work in that kind of a way. We just use the law of non-contradiction to describe reality as best we can. But the reality doesn't operate on the law of non-contradiction.
Well, sure. So I'm not, for example, I don't want to make a claim about quantum mechanics. I'm not, in the realm of qualification. With Schrodinger's cat, that seems an odd example to me, because to me that seems more of a statement of we just don't know, so we can't make a claim. But I mean, it is either dead or alive, right?
Well, no, that's the point in quantum mechanics, is that until the particle collapses, it's not. That was the point of the double slit experiment, is that the particle interacts with itself when it's in a wave form to be able to move to create a wave pattern on the back of the sheet or whatever. And so it isn't in one or the other. It's in both at the same time somehow, and we don't understand it at all. So the point of quantum mechanics, which there's a logic for it called quantum logic, is that no, it's both dead and alive at the exact same time, and that's what all the experiments show, and we have no idea.
Okay, so I misunderstood. So that's just an analogy. We're not talking about an actual cat.
Yeah. The Schrodinger's cat was an analogy created by somebody.
That's my bad.
It's about the particle.
With it. Okay.
So it's an analogy of the particle.
Okay, well, chalk that one up to me being dumb. I did want to go on something, because last time when we talked before, we kind of got bogged down into infinities, and admittedly, I said some pretty dumb things. And I think I was just so nervous. Like, I know the difference between potential and actual infinites, and it's not even something I've learned since then. I knew it then, but you had said infinity, and then kind of there are different kinds of infinity, and my brain wanted to bog down on, well, there's not different kinds of actual infinites, and I was completely forgetting potential infinites, and yes, there are many different kinds there. And then so some of the examples you were giving, I should have known, and it's like, okay, yeah, obviously if we're talking about potential infinites, it applies there, and I was just getting bogged down and disagreeing sillily. But maybe just to touch on it real quick, because it seemed to me, and I've heard you say things since then, talking about actual infinity isn't something that exists in the world, like X isn't something that exists in the world, like it's kind of a place marker, and then, okay, you can have different quantities of X and depending on the equations and different things. But it seemed to me when we talked, kind of the conclusion you were getting at was, well, just because we can't, say, prove actual infinity exists out in the world, it might just be beyond our realm of comprehension, kind of how you were drawing the analogy to a 4D object instead of a 3D object. There's nothing about the universe this is a 4D object. It can exist, just that we can't necessarily conceive of it. So where exactly would you line up in there with actual infinites actually existing versus potential infinites?
All right, so in set theory, there's no such thing as actual and potential infinites. It's kind of just a philosophy kind of thing and just theology. It doesn't really exist in most in physics. There's no such thing. That's not a real distinction in physics. It's not a real distinction in set theory. So there's a video on YouTube called "How Many Kinds of Infinite Are There" by V. Hart, a mathematician, and it goes through like dozens and dozens and dozens of types of different kinds of infinites. There's no distinction between potential and actual here. So the reason there can't be an actual infinite is the same reason there can't be an actual X. Like if you have a box and there's apples in the box, you're not going to find X number of apples in the box because there's a finite number of apples. There's a real number of apples in the box. X is just a variable. Infinite is the same thing. Infinite is a variable, or is a description of a set. So it's like saying fuzzy in a box. Like there can't be a fuzzy in the box because fuzzy is an adjective. It applies to something. It isn't a thing in itself. Infinite is the same kind of thing. Infinite is not a thing. It's an adjective that describes things. So there could be a universe that consists of a set which has the property of infinite, but it can't be itself infinite. So just like there can be a box with the set of apples that can be described by X, but it's not itself X number of apples. So the reason there can't be an actual infinite is because infinite isn't a thing, just like there can't be an actual fuzzy, because this fuzzy isn't a thing, it's an adjective. So, but there's no contradiction with saying that there could be an actually existing set of things which has the property of infinite. There's no contradiction there. It doesn't exist in physics. It doesn't exist in set theory. There's no contradiction there. The reason people argue that was like Hilbert's Hotel and Cantor's kind of cardinal and ordinal infinites. Those problems don't really work when we're talking about modern set theory. We've moved past those problems, and we can describe infinites in many different ways with no problems now, and no one has a problem with actually existing infinites in the sense that apologists use them in physics or in set theory. So it's not really a thing in physics. And you can just check out how many kinds of infinite are there. When I in our conversation, when I was talking about all of the many types of infinites, I wasn't making the distinction between actual and potential. I was talking about set theory, the kind in the video described that I mentioned.
Sure. Okay, so according to that, would are you making a claim that, say, in any case that we're using infinite as an adjective for something, would you say that something is always a finite set?
No, not necessarily. There's no contradiction with saying there is a set that has the property of infinite that actually exists. There's no problem. There's no contradiction.
Okay, so I mean, so instead of say making a distinction between potential and actual infinite, you would just say, we'll get rid of the distinction. Sometimes this adjective is describing what apologists often refer to as an actual infinite, or sometimes it's describing what apologists refer to as a potential infinite, which is kind of like a finite set increasing.
Well, I would say that that distinction just doesn't exist in physics or set theory. Like there is no such distinction. It's like saying a distinction between blue and screw or something. There's just not a thing. Like
Right.
there's nothing in physics that makes a distinction between an actual and potential infinite. All of the infinites in physics are actual infinites, essentially in physics. They don't say this is a potential infinite. They
But
say this is an
right, okay,
actual
but
infinite.
are some of those finite sets? And again, these aren't trick questions. I'm just trying to figure this out.
No, the whole point of like Feynman diagrams and Richard Feynman's work is that you have to calculate all of the infinite possibilities. Like they are literally infinite possibilities, and the infinites used in the math are meant to describe actual infinites of reality, whatever that means. So it's not about because they're describing physical processes, and the physical processes have infinitely many ways they work,
Okay.
and actually like actual work, not potentially work, actually work. And so the equations describe all of those infinitely many ways, and they use the infinites to do that. So they're describing actual infinites in physics. There's not like a potential infinite distinction there. It's like this is how it actually works, kind of a thing.
So none of those are finite sets. So we're talking about would a good way to describe, say, like a limitless set or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, you can use the apologist term. It's an actual infinite. It's an existing actual infinite. That's
Okay.
what they do in physics.
Okay. So now I'm getting confused, and not to get bogged down on the same point we did before, but it seems to me if you're just, let's say you have two sets that are both limitless. What I'm confused about is how we would say, okay, one of those is bigger than the other one, or if we even
Uh,
could justify a claim like that.
well, I mean, if we could do mathematics with them, like if we could like literally subtract one for the other or add one for the other, we could find out which one is bigger. But if like you had two physical sets, there's no way we could actually describe one as being bigger than the other because we wouldn't have the technology to actually like compare the two.
Right.
But
Well, but
mathematically, it's
that was
possible.
just a point that had been made before, I remember. Because I think you gave the
So I mean,
example, say, between 1 and 3 or between 1 and 5, one is a bigger infinite, but they're both infinite.
oh, yeah, yeah. So there is a way mathematically to show one infinite is bigger than the other. I don't remember the exact. I'm pretty sure it's Cantor's proof, one of Cantor's proofs, but it has to do with numbers. If you take a set of all numbers and just counting like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then just do 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Like if you create a graph and you list all numbers, just start at 1, just go up, and then start at 2 and go up, and then go 3 and go up in the next line by line. And so you're going like 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, and then every row is going to be one off. So it's going to be counting literally every single number over and over and over again in every possible combination of ways. But in all of those lines, there's going to be one number that they'll never get, which is the diagonal. So if you take, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you go like diagonally and count all these numbers. That combination of numbers will never be in the original 2D graph. So there's infinitely many numbers being listed in this 2D graph of just listing numbers, but there's one number that's never being listed on it, which is this diagonal combination of numbers. So you have one infinite, which is the infinite set of all of the lists, this 2D list. And then there's another infinite, which is bigger than that, which is the collection of all of those numbers plus this other number, or this other set of numbers that is the diagonal set. So you can definitely show that some infinites are bigger than other infinites using abstract mathematics. Um, I don't remember. I'm pretty sure it's one of Cantor's proofs that does that.
Mm. So okay, so at the risk of sounding stupid, because I'm not a mathematician, um, and I'm just kind of probing a little bit, kind of trying to thinking as I go. So, saying that there are certain numbers that are excluded from the set, to me that doesn't justify, and maybe it's just my not knowing better, but to me that doesn't justify saying one is bigger than the other, no more than it would like say an actual infinite set of macaroni noodles versus an actual infinite set of water bottles. Okay, well one set, the macaroni noodle set doesn't include water bottles, and the water bottle set doesn't include macaroni noodles. But if they're both infinite, we could if they're both limitless, it seems to me they're the same size. We wouldn't necessarily say one's bigger than the other.
Well, no, so again, the idea is that in the first 2D set, it includes all countable numbers. So
Okay.
every single number we could ever count is in there. But here's a number that isn't in there.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the set of the countable numbers and the set of the uncountable numbers. They're
Right.
both numbers. So we have a set of countable numbers, which is infinite, and a set of uncountable numbers, which is infinite, and we have a set of numbers, both countable and uncountable, which is bigger than both the numbers and the uncountable numbers, because it has both of them in it.
Sure. And again,
So does that?
well, no, it doesn't. Again, at the risk of sounding stupid, because I'm just trying to probe and think more as we're going through this. Okay, so we have three piles. Okay, in this pile, we're gonna begin stacking the real numbers you said, and then the imaginary numbers. Was that the distinction you made, or am I missing it? Okay, and then
Yeah.
third set.
So countable and uncountable.
Okay,
Imaginary is something different. But yeah,
okay. So countable and uncountable. Okay, so those are the first stacks, and then the third stack we're gonna stack countable and uncountable together, right?
right,
Okay, so we're stacking all of them. All three are limitless,
right. They're all infinite.
right? Okay, so is this third stack the one that has countable and uncountable hypothetically gonna be higher than the other two?
Yes, yes.
But the first two go up limitlessly.
Right. That's again, there's different sizes of infinites. There's different. I would suggest go to the video. How many kinds of infinites are there? They're the mathematicians. They can explain this really, really well.
Yeah.
Um, the title is "How Many Kinds of Infinites Are There" by Vihart. They do a really great job of explaining this. Yes, there are many different sizes of infinites.
Okay.
Many of them are bigger than others. There's countable infinites. There's things that are bigger than countable
Yeah.
infinites. There's infinites that encompass other infinites. The biggest ones are Big Omega and Big Theta. I remember that. Those are my favorite ones.
Hmm.
But yes, there are tons of different kinds of infinites.
Right on. And again,
15
I'm
minute
not trying to
video.
like challenge you or debate you on this. I'm just if something doesn't make sense to me, I like to kind of probe and try to
Right.
figure it out. Um, okay, so I do want to move on to free will because you did present to me an argument that I had heard for the first time, and so well actually I'll let you kind of lay that out now briefly if you don't mind because you seem to
Oh, yeah,
suggest
sure.
that free will even in principle is impossible.
Well, it's impossible for us to conceive or describe of. So I wouldn't say it's ontologically impossible. I just say
Okay.
the idea is impossible, like a square circle kind of thing. So my argument is that everything you do, every action you decide to do, is either done for reasons, in which case it's determined by those reasons and not free because it's determined, or it's done for no reasons, in which case it's random and not free. So either you have the option determined and not free or random and not free. And there's no way to add something to that, as far as I know, that can get you out of that dichotomy of determined or random and get you an actually free choice. So every action you take is either determined or random. There's no way to get free will.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I don't have like I certainly wouldn't say like a knockdown argument against that or something. I just have some thoughts. So I wouldn't personally necessarily think I do have to add something to the dichotomy. I think I'm okay with the dichotomy. I think I would just perhaps suggest that the reason in some cases would be the free choice.
Okay, and let's just grant that for a moment. And so is this free choice? Is this free choice done for reasons or is it done for no reasons?
I would say there's
Let's say
I, w-
let's say you pick something, just pick any option A or option B, let's say, and you have reasons and you have randomness. You say, okay, so there's third option, free choice, and this free choice picks A. All right, how did it pick A? Did it pick A for reasons or did it pick A for no reasons?
pick A. Um, well, most likely reasons, unless someone's told me to randomly do something, and I just kind of closed my eyes and grabbed it out of there.
Right. So it was determined. So how is that free? How is that? How did the free choice make that action if it was determined by reasons?
So I think the and I'm trying to avoid certain terminology here, but I might not be able to. So I do believe that there is kind of a soul distinct from the body, right? And so now I wouldn't say that soul is what would you say? Completely free of the burden from any kind of determining reasons, right? So, for example, if someone gives me a choice of foods to pick from for like my next meal, assuming that I want to enjoy the meal, there are certain deterministic reasons that will kind of eliminate certain things, as my taste buds just don't like those things or don't favor those things. And I would agree that there are all these kind of deterministic factors, even kind of when you narrow down, say that, okay, these last 3 meals I like, there are certain deterministic reasons. I wouldn't say, though, that those deterministic reasons, what would you say, so overburden the soul that it couldn't overcome them and still pick one. Like, even if I was determined to pick chicken, I don't just agree that negates the soul's freedom in picking chicken, if that made sense.
I think you're confusing determinism with materialistic determinism. So when I say determined by reasons, I mean anything. I'm not just talking about physicalism. I mean, if there is a supernatural soul and it chooses to do things completely apart from the material world entirely, if there's a God and the God chooses to do things, it has 2 options. Either it's going to choose things for reasons and be determined for those reasons. They could be supernatural reasons. That's totally fine. Or it's going to choose them for no reason. This is going to be random. So let's say God decides to create the universe. There's only 2 possibilities here. Either he did it because he was determined to by something like his nature, or he had no reasons to do it, and it was just a random decision. There's nothing you can add to that to get free will. It doesn't matter if it's physical, natural, deterministic, supernatural,
Unless
quantum fuzziness.
And maybe this is just where I'm missing something. I don't see why it's just saying the reason was his free choice.
Because that's like saying his reason was his reason. It's just circular. There's nothing
Sure.
there that you've added that gets you out of like determinism. So it's saying the reason I did something was because of my nature or my brain. Like that's still determined. It's not free. So you've just added the term free to a determined reason and called it free.
Okay, so this is so I definitely get what you're saying, and I agree with a lot of it. And this is kind of taking me past the limits of my ability to think on something as complex as this. Um,
Well, let me try to explain just one more time. If you
yeah.
take that term free, you freely choose to do something. How did you do it? Like there's only 2 options. Either you did it because of reasons, or you did it for no reasons. So you've called this thing free. We don't know what it is yet. You just like put a label around a box around this action you've done, making a choice, and you've called this free. And I want to say, well, what's in this box? How did you make a free decision? So any decision you make, you're either going to have to make it for reasons and it's going to be determined by those reasons, or you have to make it for no reasons and it's going to be random. So just calling it free isn't good enough. You're going to have to go further than that and explain how is it free? Because if you did it for reasons, it's determined, and if you did it for no reasons, it's random. So how exactly is that free?
Okay, so I don't want dead air here, but I do have to think about that for a minute, if it's okay.
That's fair.
Hmm. Because it's this is really difficult to me because I don't think I'm actually disagreeing with anything you're saying. I think I'm just unable to articulate why I feel that even though I agree with everything you're saying, I don't think it's incompatible with free will being part of that process. So we might have to put a kind of pin in it. I'll give it to you for now. Like I'll give it to you, and we might come back. Is that okay if we kind of come back to this in a future program or
Yeah.
something?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. I've been trying to, because people say that a lot, and I'm not sure how to explain it to them clearly enough. But it's practicing trying to explain that is important. But yeah,
Yeah,
so we'll
because
get back to that
I'm not
later.
disagreeing. I don't think I'm not understanding anything you're saying because I think I'm understanding it and agreeing with it. But there's part of me Because kind of even in our own personal experience, even if I could tell you all the reasons I did X number of actions yesterday and what order I did them, there's still kind of something that intuitively says I had the freedom.
I just had an idea.
Okay.
I just had an idea. So let's say we have this dichotomy. Either you do things for reasons or you do things for no reasons. And I said there's a way out of it. It's called magic. So your actions aren't either determined or random.
I want to be clear. I'm not arguing the magic thing.
No, this is me. This is my argument.
I know. Fair
enough. My argument. All right. So there's this third option called magic. And so you come at me and say it's not determined, it's not random, it's magic. I would say, okay. So how did that magic complete the task? How did that magic make a choice without it being determined and without it being random? Well, it's magic. What do you mean it's magic? Like you have to explain, like, how did it make a decision, a choice that wasn't done for reasons or was done for no reasons? Well, you say it's magic. Well, that doesn't explain anything. You've just said it's magic. You just labeled this action with a title, but you haven't explained how it did something that wasn't determined by reasons or done for no reasons. So you'd have to go deeper into that and explain how exactly this choice was made by magic that wasn't determined and wasn't non-determined. The same thing applies to free will. So just calling something free will doesn't get you anywhere. You have to explain how the decision was made without reasons or with no reasons. How does it do that in the third option? Just labeling it isn't an answer.
Right. Yeah. So and so I want to be clear. When I'm not trying to insert free will as a third alternative. I think, like, because you could describe different kinds of reasons, different kinds of causes, and I'm kind of suggesting, without doing a very good job of giving good grounds for it, that free will is one of those reasons or one of those causes.
How is it, if it's determined or random, how is it free?
Well, so instead of the dichotomy of determined or random, I was kind of thinking of the dichotomy of a reason or a non-reason.
Well, those are the same thing. If it's a reason, it's determined. If it's non-reason, it's random.
Oh, so maybe that's where we're disagreeing. So when you talk about something being determined, does this necessarily have to kind of happen in a linear sequence?
Not necessarily. I don't know. I haven't really, because it's just a abstract dichotomy here. So if something is done for reasons, then it's determined by those reasons. If something is done for no reasons, then it's by definition random. So if it's done for reasons, it's determined, and if it's done for no reasons, it's random. And I don't see a way out of that. So if you say free will is one of those two, well, neither of those two can be free. By definition, if it's determined by reasons, it's not free. If it's done for no reasons, it's not free. So I don't see how either of those two could be free.
So, and again, I'm just spitballing here. I'm like at the limits of my ability to do this now. So you can think of determination in kind of the typical way it's discussed as kind of prior determination. So, for example, the way my biology is, where you could say determines certain future decisions I make, because it determines the way my brain works. It determines, certain skills versus other skills versus my taste buds. That's probably a more obvious example to people, is it'll determine what foods I like versus foods I don't like. Okay, so you can think of that. But then there might also be, what would you say, simultaneous determination, right? So something, say a reason for me having to do something didn't necessarily precede this moment, but rather there are a bunch of things that happen this moment, and a lot of them kind of play a deterministic role in a specific choice I make. Does that make sense so far?
Sure.
Okay. And so maybe where I think free will comes in, because I mean, and obviously, so think like a tree. Like a tree is determined to grow a certain height. There's no free will play in there, right? Because there's not kind of a mind. So I'm kind of, what would you say, suggesting that, okay, there's a soul, right? And the soul is bound by a lot of deterministic factors, namely the body that it's kind of stuck navigating the world through. But the soul is the thing that navigates through all those deterministic factors. And so the soul can, sorry, bless you, is able to navigate. And so even with this kind of simultaneous causation, or what would you say, simultaneous determination, the soul still has to navigate that stuff. And so it's not as like a computer that you could just input on all the information and it would have to spit out a certain thing. The soul is what's determining what's spit out, and it's able to navigate through those things. And as I'm saying it, I'm realizing that the counter argument can just be, well, the soul had a reason for navigating a certain way. And
Right. It's an infinite regress. So anything you say, I can just put, okay, was that done for a reason or no reason? And then if you have any kind of response to that, okay, was that done for a reason or no reason? And you have a response to that, okay, is that done for a reason or no reason? There's an infinite regress there that you'd have to find a third option to get out of it.
mm,
Because all of the options, no matter how much you add there, is always going to fall into that dichotomy because it's a P or not P dichotomy, reasons or no reasons.
okay, no, that's good. Okay, wow, okay, so I definitely, I'm glad we did that because that's given me a lot to think about. And I'll really have to sharpen this because I'm sorry, and this isn't a good argument, but there's just something so intuitively that like intuitively I have free will, and so it's like I feel compelled to defend that in some way. But you're giving me good arguments to make that difficult. So okay, so we did talk about this a little bit last time. So okay, so we go from there. Okay, so no free will, and we kind of touched on. Okay, well then how are we justified in anything we believe, even the belief of whether or not we can make claims about other possible worlds, or the very arguments we're making now, or if we think that there are good reasons or aren't good reasons to believe a God exists. So how can we move past, okay, there's no free will to, but we're justified in this discussion we're having, for example?
Well, again, you don't need free will to be justified in anything. It's like if you're determined to believe something, that belief is justified independent of why you believe it. It's like the genetic fallacy,
Sure.
where you get your beliefs doesn't make them false, true or
Right.
false. So, for example, the justification comes from epistemic grounding, which is regardless of why you believe it. So it's like if it's called in philosophy, the position is called fallibilism. If you have some kind of justification and of a belief and it happens to be true, well, then it's a justified true belief. You can call it knowledge, regardless of whether or not you know it with absolute certainty or not. So we can be justified in believing things just like a calculator is justified in believing things. It does it, even though the calculator is determined, it can still be right.
Yeah.
So it might be wrong, but it can also be right. So whether or not the calculator is justified or has a justified belief isn't dependent upon whether or not the calculator is determined or free.
Sure.
It doesn't need to be free to be justified. So it's a separate category of questions. Is the belief justified is completely separate from whether or not we have free will. They're not connected. You can have it with or without.
Sure. Yeah, so I think my question would be more as how we are justified in holding the belief, not because I would agree. So, for example, you're determined to believe there's a tree in spot X in your backyard, and I'm determined to believe there's not a tree there. Well, there either is a tree there or it isn't a tree there, and it really doesn't. That's not related to our beliefs or how we came to those beliefs. But it potentially calls into question. How am I trying to say this? Because you could say there's a separate thing between the objective justification of the actual existence of the tree versus the justification of our beliefs of it. And it seems to me, if we're both determined, we're equally justified in our beliefs, but one of us is still wrong.
Right. That's where the position of fallibilism, the philosopher's take, comes in, is that you have a belief and you have a justification for that belief, and if it's true, then it's knowledge. So it takes into account that objective truth to say, well, whether or not it's justified or not, or whether or not it's an actual knowledge or not. And
Right.
I'm not a big fan of fallibilism because it pretty much just has to assume that things are true. We don't know. The honest answer is that we don't have any true justification in that way. We don't. We don't under naturalism and we don't under theism. The argument under theism is that we can believe we have knowledge of reality because God gives us accurate or gives us access to reality or access to true knowledge about reality because of something about his property or something. But that's called the Cartesian circle. If you use that argument, it's viciously circular in the same way if we just said, well, nature just gives us access to the way reality really is. It just tells us it by random or something. So there isn't actually a way to get infallible knowledge or infallible justification in that way, in any worldview, as far as we know. So the best we have right now is fallibilism in philosophy, where it's just kind of, we have a justification, we have a belief. If the belief is true, then it counts as knowledge.
Yeah. And so I think you may have said this already. My initial reaction to that is, well, I don't think we could ever have what they would call justified knowledge, because it would seem like it's like, okay, so you and I equally determined about our opposite beliefs about this tree, right? Well, and then a third party comes in and says, okay, but in order for that to justify as actual knowledge, not only do you have to have the belief, but it actually has to be the case that the tree is really there. But then their
Right.
belief about whether or not the tree is there as the third party making the determination is also determined. And so to me, that doesn't actually get outside what you and I believe to say, well, one of you is objectively right and objectively wrong, even though you were both equally determined in your beliefs.
Right, right. We can't determine who's objectively right and who's objectively wrong. We just
Okay.
have to assume that one of them is right, and whichever one is right,
Hmm.
that person is justified and has knowledge. We just don't know which
Okay.
one of us has knowledge.
Right. Okay. So, okay, so here's a question that kind of just came to me. So what would you say is kind of like the purpose in the discussion we're having right now? Right? Because like you and I obviously have very different worldviews. And I might try to give good arguments for mine, you give good arguments for yours, and then we both can kind of change and adjust our beliefs, and we're both trying to work to the truth together, right? But if like all of that's completely determined, like, okay, well, here's a hypothetical. Your worldview is the correct one objectively or ontologically speaking, and mine is invalid, right? And then so you might say, okay, well, the purpose of us having this discussion is so that, as we work through this, I get closer to your worldview, because we hope that if your worldview is the objectively true one, that the arguments and the evidence is in favor of that. And so I would at least hope that what would happen with me in having a conversation like this is I would start being compelled by those arguments and start moving closer to your worldview. But it seems if everything's determined, it could just so happen to be determined that what happens is you end up being compelled by my arguments, even though my worldview is the false one. But for some reason, you were just determined to find this compelling and move closer to my worldview, even though it was incorrect. So how do we get out of that and even say, well, that there's a good reason for having this kind of discussion and trying to move to what we at least think is the truth?
Well, we're determined to believe things that are reasonable and rational and logical, as far as we can tell, in the ways that our brain works. And so if someone can present a more reasonable or rational argument, you're determined to believe that more than your position. So, for example, my free will defense, you said it was a good, or my free will argument against free will, you said that was a good argument or something that you really had to think about. You were determined to think about that argument because it's a good argument. And it causes you to shift in some way the way you think about your position. And so if we think about it like, if we're all like just sheep running in every random direction, and there's cliffs on all sides except one, and my goal is to give you the rational arguments to cause you to change direction and go into the non-cliff direction, you're determined by those arguments. Like, it's not the fact that you're determined by those arguments is why the discussion is important. Because if I can give you the rational arguments, you're determined to change direction. If you weren't determined by those reasons, there'd be no point in having the discussion, because it would just be a random result regardless of what I say.
Mm.
So the fact that it's determined is what makes the conversation worth having, because if you're determined by rational logic and reason, then I can change your position. I can cause you to stop going towards the cliff and go towards the correct, what I believe to be the correct direction. So the fact it's determined is what makes the conversations worth having, because you're determined to change direction under certain circumstances.
Mm. So two responses to that. So the first is, I mean, I like to think I'm an open-minded person, right? I like to do the best to be not so bogged down in my worldview that I'm unable to consider other points and change my mind on things. But we certainly know there are people who aren't like that. There are people who get more entrenched in their views, and that's when like scientists talk about confirmation bias, and people kind of fill their own Facebook feeds with more and more information that continually confirms their worldview and excludes evidence against it. So I would say not always. I mean, you could easily be sitting down right now with someone other than me who certainly isn't open-minded, and the more you argue against free will, the more they're going to get bogged down and say, no, free will has to be exactly what it is. And then the second thing is, it sounds like the argument we made was what we both seem to agree couldn't be the case as far as justified knowledge, because it seemed like you went outside the determination factor to say, okay, we're determined to believe what has good reason in reality. But that's that kind of, third party objective justification we see. I thought we agreed that what a third party couldn't really know because they were determined also.
So the first thing is that you're right that there are some people who won't change their minds, but there are some people who will. And the point of having the conversation is to shift the ideas of those who will, even if it doesn't change everybody's
Sure.
mind. It's not whatever. But the second thing is that, again, I would encourage you to look up fallibilism in philosophy.
Hmm.
The goal is to provide the justifications. Now, we're determined by the justifications. Now, whether or not those justifications are true or not, we can't know. But we do know that we are determined to follow the justifications if they conform to logic in some degree and are compelling. And so the goal is to present those to cause people to change direction. And whether or not the direction is true or not is unknown, but we can use the determined factors that cause them to be compelled to change their direction. And that's the goal of the conversation, is to change their direction into what we believe is the correct justified position.
So I don't disagree. I guess what I'm questioning is how we get outside to determine, okay, the people who are willing to change their minds in the course of the conversation, which you and I agree is a great value. It's one of my highest values. Okay, but so that person's kind of determined to be more willing to change their mind, and here this other person is determined to like plant their foot down, say, no, you're not changing my mind, and I'm only going to fill my Facebook feed with information that agrees with my worldview. How do we determine which determination is, struggling for the right words here, but more in line with the truth than the other one? Okay.
Again, so we present the rational arguments to cause them to change direction. Some will change direction, some won't. We don't know what the absolute truth is, but we just do the best we can. That's the whole point of fallibilism. It's just we don't know anything with absolute certainty. We can never have those kinds of absolute grounds of infallible knowledge, regardless of our worldview. Even if there's a God, that still doesn't help us. The only things we can do, the best justification for knowledge we have, is fallibilism, which is just we have a justification for our belief. And if the belief is true, then it's knowledge. And if it's not knowledge. But we're going to do the best we can to try and articulate that with logic to cause people to go with the best logically justified position we have, regardless of whether or not we can prove it's true. If we don't have infallible knowledge of it, doesn't make a difference. This is the best we have.
Okay. No, fair enough. So before we go, I did want to just kind of, again, this could easily open up a whole can of worms, the problem of evil. I do just want to kind of give some thoughts from that kind of occurred to me when I was watching your debate with Stephen Worthy. I encourage everybody to go look that up. It was fantastic. So the problem of evil. So it seemed to me. Okay, well, maybe lay out your case, because I don't want to straw man your case. If there's a brief way of stating it.
Yeah, sure. All right. So if you imagine two options, one, you give a person the option to do action X, doesn't matter what action X is, like eat an apple, as opposed to forcing them to do action X, like forcing them to eat the apple. Giving them the option is always more moral than forcing them to do it. And so if you imagine this world, if God gave every person the option to be here or the option to opt out and go to their own world, that would be morally superior than forcing us to be here against our will. And so the fact that we were forced to be here against our will is necessarily a less moral option. And so if there was a truly all good, all powerful being, he would have necessarily done the more moral thing, which would be to give us the option to go to our own universe and opt out. Since we didn't, that's evidence that there is no God, because he didn't do the more moral thing. And so there can't be an all good, all powerful God. And I'd apply the same argument to hell and heaven. The same analogy, if we're given the option to do X as opposed to being forced to do X, it's always morally superior. So being given the option to go to hell or heaven or to opt out and go to our third option is always morally superior than forcing us to do one or the other without our consent. The fact that we're forced to either do hell or heaven, we don't have the option. The third option of go to our own universe means God is necessarily immoral because he's not giving us the most moral option.
Okay, and so during the debate, and correct me if I'm wrong, so you have two worlds. One is, say, the current world we live, and then, say, world two is kind of a world that people kind of have the option to opt out of this one and go to this one, right? It seemed to me you were willing to grant that in this world, God could possibly have unknown reasons for allowing, say, a particular kind of suffering, even if it's a really bad kind of suffering. God could have unknown reasons for allowing it. But what you seemed to was just say, but all I have to do to add to make this a morally superior universe is say people can choose that, the world in which God has these unknown reasons for really bad suffering, or they can also have this additional choice of this other world over here of their own.
Not exactly. So God has these unknown reasons for causing suffering. What we can do is we can say, God can give people the option and say, you could choose to have this benefit of whatever this unknown reason is and the suffering and go be a part of that world. Or you can choose to opt out from both and say, I don't want the benefit or the suffering. I'm just going to go to my own universe. So it's all the same world. I'm not saying that there's a world without the reason. He can have the reason in all the worlds, but he can make both that reason and the positive benefit it has and the suffering optional, both of them
Okay.
optional, and say you can choose both of these, or you can just opt out of both and go to your own world.
So would you say it's possible that, say, there are certain kinds of benefits that would only come if you didn't know the benefits? Like you had to go through the suffering, and kind of like if you were only doing the suffering for the sake of the benefit, that would kind of, say, remove a moral aspect of the suffering. So would you say that there maybe are certain sufferings in which you can't necessarily know what the benefit is? Like that benefit can only come in the face of suffering and not necessarily understanding why you're suffering.
Well, I would argue against that, but we can just grant that. Let's say that is the case. God can still say there are these unknown benefits if you experience suffering. Would you like to go to this world, or would you like to opt out? So even
Right.
if I grant that, I can still go back and say, okay, make it optional.
Okay, yeah, so that's fine. So it seemed to me what Stephen added was is if you're willing to grant that maybe say there are certain unknown reasons for suffering that are that make the suffering worthwhile. Let's say even if in a really terrible particular instance of suffering, you can look at somebody at the end of that journey and they say, yeah, I'd go through it again because it was worth it considering what the outcome was. What Stephen seemed to add was, well, maybe God could also have an overall good reason for not giving someone the option to go to their own universe. So where would you disagree there? Because it seems to me if we're willing to grant that there's unknown reasons for suffering, then maybe there can also be an unknown reason for not giving someone that option to go to their own universe.
No, because it can always be made morally superior. Just give them the option. Say, okay, so you could have this morally better option where I decide for you, or you could go to your own universe. So now it's morally superior, no matter what. It's kind of like the example with free will, where you can always go one level further. Is this determined or is this random? You can do the same thing with this argument with morality. It's always more moral to give someone the option to do X rather than to force them to do X. No unknown reason can ever change that, because you can always just say, make it optional. So whatever this potential reason could be, you can always just make it more moral by making it optional, just like in the example, the first example I gave. You can think of two possibilities. Give the person the option to do X or force them to do X. Doesn't matter what X
Sure,
is, no matter what it is, the first option is always going to be more moral in all possible worlds, essentially.
sure. So would we say that it's at least possible that, let's say, the outcome in a universe where God doesn't give someone the choice to go to their own universe, it could potentially be better than an outcome in which somebody was able to choose to go to their own universe, but regardless of the fact that the outcome is better in the world that they didn't have the choice, it's still more moral if they have the choice. Is that kind of your argument? Or would you at least
Yes.
grant that premise in extension to that argument?
Uh, yes, essentially that's my argument. So it's always more moral to give people the choice, even if they want to choose an outcome that would be less good, especially from the God's perspective.
Sure. Okay, so here's where we're going to lead into kind of the implications of heaven and hell here. And so what I would say, and I haven't thought this through a whole lot, so bear with me here, is it seems to me hell is kind of, well, okay, you have this option. You don't want the world we're in, and of course we're talking the afterlife now. We're not talking about during this life, okay? But it comes to the
Right.
afterlife, and you say, okay, you don't want heaven, and let's say there are two logical possibilities. There are people talking about. Maybe you'll disagree with this premise, but you're either with God in the afterlife if you're without Him, and with Him is heaven, and without Him is hell. And so, at least in the afterlife, God's saying, okay, here you can choose to go for your own universe. That's hell. Now He's not giving us that choice, say, prior to this life, because at least in this life there are certain pieces of knowledge we're getting. I know you had an extensive discussion with Clay Jones, was it? And you guys got into kind of all the nitty gritties of this, and so I'm not necessarily trying to get into all that, but okay, so God is deliberately giving us pieces of knowledge here. That's why He has us live this life, and then it comes to a place where we can choose our own universe. Now, obviously, hell is not what we would call a happy universe that anybody would necessarily choose, but it seems to me at that point what we're asking of God is that, okay, He give us the option to go to this universe, but He also sustains it, because any world in which, say, God, and of course we're going on Christian theology here, right? Any universe in which, say, God completely withdraws His presence, if God is the source of all good things, then that universe is not going to be good if God is completely withdrawn from it. So I guess what I'm missing is kind of the expectation of God, if we do choose to go to our own universe, is the expectation of God to say, but I'm going to sustain that even if you said you don't want anything to do with me, or you don't want anything to do with having a relationship with me or anything like that.
So a couple things there. If that's what hell was like and we all just get our own universe, I'd be okay with hell. That's fine. If we just forget the fact that it's still immoral to force us to be a part of this world without suffering and just say afterlife, start at the afterlife. And the options are go to heaven or go to your own universe. That would be cool. I'm okay with that if that was the case. The second part is that since God created us as beings, he's obligated to support the universe, like allow it to exist or whatever. If he forces us to like not be in a universe or good, if he created us, then he is immoral for doing that. He's forced us to experience suffering or whatever without our consent because he was the one who created us, and so he has that obligation morally to sustain the universe in
Which
some
I don't
sense.
completely disagree with. I would make some caveats, but I just wanted to say that real quick, that I don't completely disagree with that.
So yeah, so it's is and by sustain, I'm not sure he has to be a part of it. I just he could just create the universe and let us sustain or give us the power to sustain it. That'd be fine too, and just go away. I'm okay with
Well,
that.
even giving us the power to sustain it is still him sustaining it in some way, just through us, in a sense.
Yeah, that could be the case, and I'm okay with that. So if he wanted to do it that way, that'd be fine too. I'm
Sure.
sure there's lots of different ways he could accomplish it, being an all-powerful being. So yeah, I would say that he would be obligated to sustain it in some sense because he created us, and if it would be immoral for him to cause us suffering or to not sustain us after creating us for whatever reason.
So, okay.
Unless we chose that. If we chose that and said that'd be fine. If we don't want to be in a part of a universe, or fine. But if we chose our own universe, he'd be obligated to give it to us.
Okay, well, so I would disagree with that kind of last part. So the first point you made was, well, if it were the case that hell was just us going to our universe, you're okay with that. Now, of course, we're not getting into the whole debate, because even Christians disagree with, well, is heaven like, or I'm sorry, is hell like a literal place with demons and pitchforks and physical torturing, or is it just kind of more of a mental torment thing? Is it just the absence of God? Is there not the torture? So I'm not necessarily getting into that. I would just say that whatever hell is if it's a place with, if God was withdrawing his presence, and on Christian theology God is the source of anything good, then whatever hell is, it's not going to be good. So that'd be kind of the first part.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. Like,
Okay.
if you're just defining good as God, and we can get rid of good and keep all the stuff I like about the universe, I'm okay with that. Like that's fine.
Well,
We'll just
and
get rid
again,
of the God
the
stuff.
thing,
My universe.
I mean, some people might argue that even the stuff you like, and you believe it's coming from God, but if God is all the source of good things and you like good things, then probably nothing you like is going to be there either, because that would probably, at least on Christian theology, right, God would be the source of those things. There's the second thing you said that I don't quite remember. What was the second thing? The second point after that you made?
That if God created us, he's obligated
Yeah.
to give us the kind
So-
of universe that we would value.
Well, I do think God is obligated to us, just not in the same way. I think he's obligated to bring about the best possible outcome. And I think where your and I central disagreement, and maybe it's one we can't resolve, is I don't necessarily elevate our freedom of choice as far as certain benefits to us at the top of that good that God's obligated to give to us. I think if I'm not mistaken, your kind of philosophy would be human choice is kind of the highest value in that dichotomy of what God's obligated to us. I just don't agree. I think
Right. I would say that if you take away that choice, it's by definition slavery and by definition immoral, and so there can't be an all good, all powerful being that does that. It would just be by definition immoral to do that, to place anything above choice.
Well, I'm confused. It has to be slavery, because I was with
Well,
your
anything
worldview.
that takes away, like I gave in my debate, I gave like a legal definition of slavery. Anything
That's
that
right. Yeah, I remember
takes
that now.
away your freedom. So anything away that takes away your freedom would just be by definition slavery in some sense. So like if we're owned by him and he gets to decide his purposes of what the best universe ought to be, and he puts that above our freedom of choice, that makes us slaves to his purposes. So we are by definition slaves at that point, which is immoral.
I don't know that I agree with that definition, because I looked up the definition of slavery and I couldn't find the one you were using, and I'm not saying that means yours is wrong, by the way. I did see the way that sounds to me is number one, I would disagree that God's by definition taking away our choice. I think he's giving us choice to an extent. It's just not to the extent that we would necessarily like, and the reason is because he has an overall good, which in my worldview, that overall good is what he's obligated to to give us, because that good would be better than what we think would be best for us if we had that freedom. So he does give us freedom, a lot to choose in this life, but it's just not, say, to the ultimate extent. It's not like omni freedom to say. And I was about to say something else and it completely just left me.
Well, I mean, so
Oh, the
I wouldn't
definition of
disagree
slavery.
with.
Yeah, I think by that definition, then parents would be by definition slaveholders and their kids would be slaves if we were to apply it literally.
Yes, pretty much. So the point is, there's naturalistic limitations in this world, and so the fact that parents need to guide their children is because they have to protect them against the harms of nature. God doesn't have that excuse, so it doesn't apply to God. But the more important issue is that if you place anything above choice in the context of a God creating worlds and the beings, then it is by definition slavery. So, I mean, the way you phrased it, you made it seem like it wasn't slavery because you said God has some obligation to give us choice, but there's some greater obligation there. That's still slavery. That's still by definition slavery. Anything you place above the choice of the person you're creating and making them obligated or entailed or constrained by that greater thing makes them a slave to that greater thing. Like you're stuck in that. You don't get a free, you don't get a pass on that. It's still immoral. So if I didn't get a choice to choose to be tied into this greater good or not, then I'm being forced to abide by this greater good, this the other purpose that I don't have any say in without my consent, which is by definition slavery.
Sure. So, okay. So I want to, instead of disagreeing on definitions, I might want to try to go by yours here. So, for example, when you talk about the parents, we kind of are forced because of physical restraints. We have to guide our children. So now I don't want to strawman you. You seem to suggest that was slavery, but it's just a moral slavery. It's a morally good.
It's justified. It's a justified immoral slavery. So it's still immoral. If we could just let kids do whatever they wanted and they couldn't hurt anything, couldn't hurt themselves, that would be the morally better option. But because there's nature and nature harms us, we are justified in restricting them, even though it's immoral to do so.
I wouldn't even agree with that. I think we have a greater moral obligation to make our kids into decent human beings that other people want reciprocal relationships with, which you wouldn't get if we just let them. If we could somehow, wave a magic wand and say, okay, whatever you do is going to hurt anybody, or isn't going to hurt anybody else. I still think we would be more morally obligated to make them into decent people to share a world with other people, again in this kind of reciprocal way.
Well, again, that's one of the physical restrictions. If they can't hurt anybody and no one can hurt them, then you don't need that anymore. You can just get rid of it and say, okay, just go do whatever you want. So the only reason that restriction applies is because of the natural restriction that we have to live with other people, and there's a risk to other people if they don't like you and you don't like them.
But
if
it's
there
still
isn't
morally
that
superior, isn't it?
No. Forcing people to abide by a certain set of social constructs, whether they want to or not, is not a morally superior option. It's immoral to do so, but it's pragmatic to do so.
I just have to disagree, and I'm not trying to be a jerk or anything. I just don't agree, and maybe it's because I'm assuming certain physical restraints, but I think it's a kind of universe in which I just let my kids do whatever. Like, kids can be real jerks, and I would. If left to their own devices. I mean, I've worked with kids for a long time. I know how they can be, and then they might just run to the other side of the earth, and then they don't have a relationship with their parents anymore. I just think it's much more morally superior for the parent to raise their child to be a decent human being, to want a relationship with the parents and other people, and then a benefit to the family and to themselves, that in a way that's a benefit to their family, and both of those in a way that's a benefit to the broader society. I just don't agree. I think that's morally superior. And I think, again, with God, yeah, he is taking away freedom, but I don't think just moving, say, freedom down a couple of steps on the hierarchy makes, and to the degree in which maybe you could say that's still a form of slavery, if you want to still define that as, okay, we're slaves to, say, this greater goal, I would say, in the sense that God is navigating a universe with freedom, which, okay, we disagreed earlier that, say, free choice was necessarily part of it, but okay, let's grant it for the sake of Christian theology at least, right? God's navigating a world of free creatures to bring, say, the maximal number of people freely to himself that would freely choose to do so. The people who, say, don't freely choose it or don't want that goal, it seems to me that they're still necessary for the kind of universe in which other people would freely choose God, and I don't think they should have any sort of veto power over, say, God, you can't create this type of universe, or you can't create me and not give me the choice.
So you think they should be obligated to be slaves to this universe, even though they're not going to choose to be God
Well,
just for the benefit of the other people that
see,
will.
and this, I guess, this is kind of one of the central points. I just don't think that's slavery. I just think if God has an overall purpose for the universe, and they say, okay, I don't want any part of that purpose. Well, they freely chose to do so, but they didn't have to. God didn't force them to choose not to do so, and so they're responsible for their own decisions at that point.
Right, but they didn't choose to go to hell. They just chose not to be a part of God's universe. Now, they
Well,
should be given the choice to go to their own universe and do whatever they want.
see, and
But
that's
if
why
you're
I say
just giving
hell
them
is.
the
I would say
choice,
hell is their own universe, but I would say I don't think they should expect God to support that universe and be part of it. Which
well, it's kind of like saying the Nazi gives the Jew the choice: would you like to be gas chambered or would you like to be burned to death? Feel free to choose. It's your choice. You can choose. Go ahead. Freely choose. Well, no, that's not a choice.
no,
That's either pain or suffering. That's kind of the same thing you're saying
ah,
about God here. You can choose. You can choose to follow me, or you can choose to just go to your own universe, which I'm not going to sustain. Have
okay,
fun.
well, so
Like that's the fire or the gas.
okay, well, so there's one problem in the analogy like that kind of immediately strikes me is okay, fire and gas both bad, hell and heaven only one of them bad.
Not to the atheist. No, those are both bad.
Okay, fair enough, but I would say the and again this is the way
But
that
I mean, because I apologize to interrupt
that's
here, but
okay.
you said, remember, I've chosen that I don't want to be a part of God's plan.
Sure,
That's my choice.
sure.
So to me, being a part of God is the fire, and being with a universe where I don't get all the stuff I like is the gas. So it's a pretty apt analogy for the atheist.
Okay, so I'll agree that from the atheist perspective, that analogy, I would disagree. That's I would say that's more of if you subjectively view what I would say is an ultimate good, which is being with God, as an ultimate evil, then we just kind of have a fundamental disagreement there.
Right, and that's the whole point is that from the perspective of the atheist, since they are choosing to not be a part of this world, God is
Sure.
forcing them to choose between the fire and the gas, and He's not giving them an option. Just like
Well,
the
no.
Nazi is not giving the Jew an option
Well,
here
no,
when he
kind of like we
says
were
you
talking.
can choose the fire or the
Well,
gas.
kind of like what we were talking about before. You have to separate what the true thing is about the reality versus what each person say would be determined to believe. And so I'd say, yeah, the atheist can have his reasons and his justification for viewing both things as an ultimate evil. But if objectively it's not an ultimate evil, then God, it's not God just saying, here's these two terrible things you have to choose from. It's here's a good thing and a bad thing you can choose from. But then the atheist is saying, well, I think both of those are bad, so no.
Right, again, but the option is there's another morally superior option there, which is just let the atheist choose to go to their own universe. And so there's a morally superior option there, and that
But
morally superior option is not being chosen, then the God can't be moral. That's kind of the
But I
problem. It
think
doesn't
that's where
matter
we're
if it's a
disagreeing. Is
greater
I'm
good.
saying hell is
If
their
there's
own universe, but just if you want your own universe, fine. Just don't expect God to kind of uphold it and make it full of all these things you like. Not saying that to you
right, and that's
directly,
immoral.
but kind of that's just
That's immoral. That's slavery. Saying you can have your own universe with nothing in it,
I,
have fun, is the fire or the gas. That's immoral to do that. To create someone, to force them to be a part of this world, and then to give them an option of fire or gas is necessarily immoral. So the greater good is to give them the option to just go to your own universe with whatever things you want and make it self-sustaining,
no, look,
essentially.
fair enough. I think this is unfortunately a place where we're not going to be able to find because we're disagreeing over fundamental. I think we disagree over the definition of slavery over the definition of well, does choice at the highest point make a morally superior universe? I think we might just disagree with things on that, but no, I definitely really appreciate you coming on, and I'll give you the final word. If
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed our conversation. It was a good conversation. Yeah, I think that is a fundamental disagreement, and intuitively, I think that the atheist is going to win that argument because it seems pretty bad when the Christian argues that those kinds of forced indoctrinations are good. But yeah, I really enjoyed coming on. Thanks for having me on. You have a great show. I love the background. That's a really cool setup you got there. It's better than my giant chair.
I appreciate it. You can actually get a lot of people love your chair. Everybody always asks where
Yeah,
to get it. No, look, I really appreciate you coming on. I hope we can do many more of these in the future. You definitely one of the smartest guys out there, and I love this kind of thing because it forces me to really kind of sharpen my skills and my tools here because it really challenges me. Um,
yeah, thanks.
so, but other than the YouTube channel, I know there's a Patreon. Is there any, how can people support you?
Yeah, I have a Patreon and a PayPal. They're both linked in most of my newer videos. There's just a big thing, a big bar at the bottom. I don't remember. I think it's like patreon.com/TJump and paypal.me/TomJump, I think.
Awesome. Well, yeah, everybody definitely go subscribe to the YouTube channel, TJump. There's a link to it I'll add it to the description as well. Tom, thank you so much for being here, brother, and hope to get you back soon.
Yeah, absolutely.